She said no. Not once. Twice. A future king got down on one knee for Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and she looked at him, and at everything that came with him, and she declined. Not because she found him unworthy. Not because she did not feel something. But because Elizabeth had never in her life accepted the first version of anything she had not yet fully decided she wanted. Most women in her position would have said yes immediately. Said yes gratefully. Said yes before the question had finished being asked. Elizabeth was not most women. She never had been. Welcome back to Chronicles of the Crown. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this episode is where the story stops being history and starts being something closer to a masterclass. In patience. In strategy. In the art of knowing exactly what you are worth and refusing to accept anything less. When the war ended in 1918, the people who survived it did not ease gently back into ordinary life. They lunged at it. They threw themselves toward pleasure and noise and color with the raw, almost savage hunger of people who had spent 4 years staring into the dark and were now making up for every moment of it simultaneously. The 1920s arrived in Britain like a door thrown open onto a party that had already been going for hours without you, and everyone rushed through it at once. Country house weekends resumed. London's social season, those carefully choreographed months of dinners and dances and race meetings and late theatrical evenings, came roaring back with a volume the pre-war version had never managed. A new generation had inherited what remained of the old world. And they intended to enjoy it without apology and without pause. Elizabeth stepped into this atmosphere at precisely the right moment. She was 18 when the war ended. Old enough to enter society properly. Young enough to appear entirely fresh. And shaped, by privilege, by wartime discipline, by private grief managed with iron control, into someone who understood the room she was entering far better than most of its other occupants. She was not one of the reckless ones. Those bright, modern young women who cut their hair and shortened their skirts and seemed to treat convention as something designed purely for the pleasure of dismantling it. That was not Elizabeth. It was not her style. And it was not, more importantly, her strategy. She had understood something that the more obviously dazzling women around her had not. The most dangerous person in any room is never the most dramatic one. It is the one who has learned the rules so thoroughly that she can bend them without anyone noticing the bend. Elizabeth looked entirely respectable. She sounded reassuring. She wore her manners like a second skin that had never been removed. She could flirt with complete conviction while appearing not to flirt at all. She could laugh, fully, genuinely, without ever losing the invisible composure that sat beneath the laughter like ballast beneath a ship. She moved through drawing rooms like a promise. That old England was still intact. That warmth still existed. That not everything recognizable had been destroyed by the war and the grief and the scrambling modernity that followed it. Men found her irresistible. Not in spite of her composure, because of it. There is something quietly thrilling about a person who seems to want nothing, to need nothing, to be entirely sufficient to themselves. It makes you want to be the one who changes that. It makes you want to be chosen. Elizabeth collected admirers the way serious chess players collect pieces, carefully, deliberately, always thinking several moves ahead. The post-war marriage market among the English aristocracy was not a sentimental place. It never had been. But the war had changed the calculations. Old fortunes had been depleted. The rules of the social order were shifting in ways that made a good marriage more consequential than it had been for the previous generation. A well-born young woman needed to understand her position clearly. She needed to know her value, her options, and the precise art of appearing not to calculate either. The woman who seemed to want nothing had all the power. The woman who seemed to want something, who let her need show, who accepted too quickly, who appeared grateful when she should have appeared merely interested, had already lost more than she knew. Elizabeth excelled at this. She was, by every surviving account from people who knew her in those years, genuinely warm, genuinely funny, genuinely present in conversation. The charm was not a performance layered over coldness. It was real. But the clarity beneath the charm was equally real. And the two operated together so seamlessly that almost no one ever saw where one ended and the other began. Warmth that conceals precision is the most effective social weapon ever devised. Elizabeth had been carrying it since childhood. She was now deploying it at full range. She had admirers. She kept them carefully managed, close enough to remain interested, distant enough to remain uncertain. She was never cruel. She was never cold. She simply never lost herself in any of them. She moved through that gilded world with the measured pleasure of someone who knows the game is not over yet, and that settling too early, for something good but not extraordinary, would be the one mistake she could not recover from. She was waiting. Not passively. Not anxiously. With the precise, considered patience of a woman who has assessed her options and is not yet prepared to close the door on the best one. And then Prince Albert came properly into her orbit. He was not the one anyone was watching. That is the first and most important thing to understand about Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George, second son of King George V, known to family and intimates simply as Bertie. The one everyone was watching was his brother. Edward, Prince of Wales, the heir, the future king, the 1920s in human form. Handsome in ways that photographed beautifully. Modern in his tastes. Restless in his habits. He wore his royal position with an appealing suggestion that he found the whole business slightly absurd, which the crowds, who also found it slightly absurd, responded to with enormous and sustained enthusiasm. He was followed everywhere. His photograph was cut from newspapers and kept. He was the prince that the century had been waiting for. Bertie was built from entirely different material. He was shy in company, not the ordinary social shyness that fades with familiarity, but a deeper, more structural anxiety that large gatherings and formal occasions made considerably worse. He was dutiful, genuinely, quietly, consistently dutiful, in ways that impressed no one who did not already understand the cost of it. And he carried, from early childhood onward, a stammer severe enough to make every public speech, every formal occasion, every moment that required him to open his mouth and be heard, feel, on the worst days, like a private ordeal presented publicly. He had been forced as a child to use his right hand when his instinct was left-handed. He had worn leg splints to correct the shape of his knees. He had grown up under the eye of a father whose standards were exacting and whose approval, once earned, was expressed with restraint. George V was not a cruel man. But he was a demanding one. And Bertie had spent his life working toward a standard that never quite signaled satisfaction. He was, in every outward sense, a man carrying weight that he had not chosen and could not set down. He first encountered Elizabeth properly in the early 1920s, in the drawing rooms and country house weekends of the London season. And something happened that changed the trajectory of both their lives. He noticed her. Not casually. Not in passing. He noticed her the way a man notices the one thing in a room that answers a question he had not known he was asking. He was drawn to her ease in precisely the situations that cost him most. He was drawn to her warmth. Her laugh. The way she moved through difficult social moments as though difficulty itself had simply decided not to apply to her. For a man who found public life a daily negotiation with his own anxiety, a man who stood in rooms and felt the weight of every pair of eyes, Elizabeth must have seemed like something close to a miracle. In 1921, he asked her to marry him. She said no. The reasons she gave centered on her reluctance to enter royal life, to surrender the relative freedom of her aristocratic existence for the rigid, scrutinized, endlessly public existence of royalty. That reason was genuine. She had grown up near the royal world and understood its demands. She was not naive about what accepting would cost. But there was something else. Elizabeth understood, because she understood almost everything about the world she moved in, that a woman who accepts the first time sends a very specific message. And a woman who does not sends a different one entirely. She was not being cruel. She was not playing games for sport. But she was not going to foreclose her options before she was certain. And she was not yet certain. Bertie did not retreat. He told friends he intended to persist. He told his mother. He wrote letters. He made clear, through every channel available to a shy man who found direct declaration difficult, that he had decided, and that he was not the kind of man who undecided. In 1922, he asked her again. She declined again. 2 proposals. 2 rejections. A lesser man, a more prideful man, a man more concerned with the appearance of dignity than with the thing itself, would have stopped there. Would have told himself that the answer was final and found a way to believe it. Bertie was not that man. There is a version of this story where Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon ends here. Where the second rejection closes the door. Where she marries someone else, a comfortable earl, a pleasant country house, a life shaped exactly to the dimensions of what was expected, and becomes a footnote in other people's histories. That version does not exist. Because history had other plans. And so, it turns out, did Elizabeth. He would ask a third time. And the answer she gave, in a garden, in January, at the house where she had grown up, would change the British monarchy forever. Would place a man on a throne he never expected to occupy. Would put a woman in front of the cameras and the crowds and the history books in a way that would define what the British royal family meant for an entire generation. But none of that has happened yet. Right now, there is only a shy prince who refuses to give up. And a woman who has not yet decided whether that particular quality, that quiet, unshakable persistence, is exactly what she has been waiting for all along. Share this episode. Like this video. And subscribe to Chronicles of the Crown, because episode 3 is where everything Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon spent her entire life preparing for finally arrives. And when it does, it comes from a direction that nobody, including her, fully expected.